I Live a Life Like Yours is a book that touched the very core of my being. I felt a whole spectrum of emotions, from wonderment to being sad to cackling at your quiet wit, nodding at the straightforward exploration of each success, each frustration, each vulnerability, the honesty, the learning as I turned each page. It was the wisdom of living life that stared right back at me. The book actually made me question the very manner in which we live our own lives. And I'm going to turn to you as a writer. You turned your life story around, and the way you've narrated it in a way that the reader can perceive you as a human being who is enabled. You've written it so that you enable your readers, and that's very giving off of yourself through all the complexities of simply surviving. I'd like you to speak about that aspect of it.
Thank you for a very kind introduction. I think it's difficult to talk about this book without talking about how disability is often represented. It's one of those words that carries so much within it, and at the same time can often become a hindrance to telling stories. So I think in setting out to write this book, of course, disability is a very important part of my life, but I tried very hard not to write, in quotes, a disability memoir, and to simply stick as close to my embodied experience as was possible. It's one of those challenges that you often face in growing up, in deciding whether you want to be identified with or defined by one of those categories that are at least partially constructed by society. And that negotiation has been a challenge for me, as it has for many people. So I think in part, the book was my attempt to try and write my way around that and against that, to look for a different language for expressing my experiences.
Right. I can completely identify with that. I actually want to walk our readers through the preoccupation with language in your professional career, and especially with this book, came across as much deeper than being just a tool for expression for you. What are the nuances? What were you searching for when you navigated expressing yourself the way you did? Especially because the book does not move from one date to another. It seems to be a series of musings with just some stories woven in. And you've also said, quote unquote, that you were looking for a different kind of language to the one you were offered.
Yes.
The one that
yes.
I was offered, to exactly quote what you've said.
Yes. I mean, that's an excellent question, difficult question, but a very good one. I should probably start by saying that in my professional life, I do deal with language. It's one of the things I do as an academic, working on understanding different styles of language that belong to different institutions in society, for example, like medical language, which a lot of us encounter in different situations, and it's a kind of language that carries a lot of weight. I think I'll just retell one of the stories from the book, which is what happened to me shortly after I became a father, when I was speaking with my parents, and they asked me whether I wanted to take over, as it were, a small archive that they still had of all the interactions that they'd had with doctors, with bureaucrats, with other people during my childhood. So documents that dealt with me. It was about, well, a meter of documents from their shelves, which I received at my office at the University of Oslo. And I read through these papers. It took quite a while. Now, they all had to do with my childhood in one regard or another. And yet it was a very different story about my childhood than the one I remembered. I mean, I had a number of happy memories. I thought of myself as a happy child growing up, and I think I was. But at the same time, reading this story told in medical language, it seemed that my life had been quite sad, quite depressing. And so there was this disconnect in trying to understand how one story about my life could be told in this way that I at first didn't recognize at all. Of course, as I read more deeply, I started to remember some episodes, some incidents. I mean, I saw the points of contact, but at the same time, I became aware of how so many aspects of my life had been framed, had been decided, had been told through medical language, which was a mode of language that I could barely identify with at all. And that seemed like something worthy of investigation, as it were, of literary investigation.
Right. And I'm sure, and in your career dealing with linguistics, you deal with it more technically as opposed to your expression as a writer.
Yes, I do. And at the same time, I think linguists and writers do think about language in something of the same way, just in the search for precision and in ways of finding the right description. So I mean, the thing about medical language, about clinical language, is that it's incredibly precise in many ways. I mean, it has to be. It's a tool for doctors, say, to communicate precisely about bodies in rooms that leave very little room for error. But at the same time, there's so much that isn't captured by medical language. It's just the experience of reading about yourself in a doctor's journal, for I think almost everyone, can be a very disconcerting experience. If you've simply gone to an emergency room, if you read a small written report about that afterwards, then I think you'll have trouble identifying yourself with the patient in those documents, to see yourself being described more or less as a passive object. It's, on one level, it's true. It's the doctor's record of what happened. And at the same time, it's very hard to see yourself as a person in such records. So I think that that leaves a rich potential for critique, to see what is missed in medical ways of seeing the world. But it also leaves a room for exploration, almost always with medical authority, with the people who are trained to use the language, who have it as their profession. And so I wanted to see what would happen if I took excerpts of medical language, of a medical description, and tried to reframe them within a literary context, to see if something else would happen with that language.
And it's just brilliant the way you've negotiated that distance, the disconnect between the two worlds, because I would strongly urge everyone to read this book. Picking up on what you said about medical language, you've also been researching in the field of disability. And combined with this is the story of how the correct diagnosis of your condition, congenital condition, came in very late, much later. So it was almost like a moment of rebirth for you. And I quote unquote from your book where you write, "There was no way of predicting it in 1981, the year I was born, not in the way things are predicted today. Some conditions hidden in the genome can be identified. As I write this, an old dream has come one step closer to reality, the dream of cutting the mutations out of an embryo by editing its genetic code, a process not unlike the way I have edited this text. At the same time, life is unpredictable. Mutations occur spontaneously. From a certain angle, it is precisely this unpredictability that is life. There is a grandeur in this view of life," wrote Charles Darwin. "I am mutating the meaning behind his words ever so slightly. I am attempting to make them my own." That takes a lot out of a person to actually come to terms with the fact that your diagnosis came so much later.
Yes.
And how you had to redefine so many aspects of your life, your personality, your very existence. And you're talking about it, as I mentioned in the beginning before, this is where I found you coming across as a very elevated person. But I'd like you to tell us something more about this, because I think this will really be very, very impactful for our audience.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to be said about that. I think it's striking to see oneself as living in a particular historical moment. I mean, of course, that's perhaps even more salient this week than most other weeks. But for the thing that we are talking about, it's interesting to think about the power that the diagnosis wields in people's lives. I mean, having a diagnosis applied to oneself can be a huge relief in many cases. If you have something that you want to understand about yourself, if there's something you need to resolve, then a diagnostic label can be a huge source of comfort in many cases. Diagnosis can also become identity defining in ways that I think are quite subtle. It has to do with expectations about time, about prognosis, which is very closely tied up with diagnosis. And so what you are talking about in my particular case, as I describe in the book, having my diagnosis, my original diagnosis taken away, as it were, was something of an existential shock, because the label that was first applied to me when I was 2 or 3 years old became a horizon of expectations for my future. And it wasn't until I was well into my 20s that I could really start to believe that, no, this is not correct. This diagnosis is imprecise. It doesn't really define my horizon of expectations. So there is a larger history woven into that. It's those developments in medical history that we are currently living through. When diagnosis first was made, in my case, it was on the basis of muscular biopsies. I was brought into the hospital, and a sliver of muscle was removed from my right thigh, and clinical judgment was used to try to decide what diagnosis was the right one. So that's one historical moment. And then 20 some years later, it was possible to perform a genetic sequencing. And that seemed so much more accurate, so much more precise. And yet at the same time, and that's why I used the editorial metaphor, it's still not knowledge itself. It's one form of knowledge. We always use metaphors, we always use language to describe these things. We talk about the genetic code, we talk about editing the genetic code, because of course we are living in a computational age. And so that is the metaphor we reach for in most of these cases. And then we start talking about reprogramming the genome, about how we can perform more intelligent and more precise alterations. And these are, of course, very real technologies, but they are also ways of thinking about technologies. And ultimately, I think they are ways that we think about what it is to be human. This possibility, or this dream of reprogramming, is, I think, very much a product of our age, which possibly privileges software over biological hardware. And I think there are some subtleties and perhaps some dangers to that we haven't fully discussed.
Right. And it's definitely much more complicated and needs, I think, a separate discussion. But I'm going to go back to how you write about grief as being a recognition of something or someone that's gone forever. And you're talking about your own self, that someone can be a version of a self, of what you were, who you were at a particular stage in your life. And you're talking about selfhood and how it keeps changing, morphing from one stage of your life to another. And you also talk about us as human beings being palimpsests. Like we are manuscripts being written all over again, erased, rewritten, edited. So I love the way that every emotion gets nuanced at every stage of your life through language. So the deftness with which you handle it and the emotional honesty with which you've handled it is it's just gets me back to what I felt in the beginning when I said that it did touch the very core of my being. But you dealt with grief, you dealt with defining and constantly searching for yourself. I'm coming back to the self. You're in a way writing about a version of yourself that does not exist, but you write also with hope. Uh, how are you still maneuvering yourself through this? Because
Well,
according to it, it's a constant process.
it is a constant process, absolutely. And I think the book is probably shaped by the quite extensive period of time it took me to write it. I mean, I worked on this on and off for about a decade. And so there are traces of earlier thoughts, reflections on those thoughts. The process is to some extent mirrored in the writing itself. I think it's been hugely interesting to talk about this book. I mean, in formats like this one. And of course, it first came out in Norway in 2018. So I've been living with the reception of this book for about 4 years. And I no longer know whether I agree with everything I wrote in it, because I've talked to people, I've heard responses, I've seen the way it is received by readers and reactions to it. And so now I have a number of different thoughts about what I perhaps missed, what I didn't emphasize enough, and of course everything I didn't say because I hadn't thought it all out when writing that book. That's what makes writing so fascinating. I mean, it's the old Samuel Beckett quote, isn't it? Fail again, fail better. The writing is never done. There's always something to be left behind for the next book. Yeah, but I kind of want to pick up on what you said about grief as well, because that is, of course, a very important motif in the book. And part of what I'm writing about is something that is perhaps specific to me and perhaps common to everyone who has had to plan very thoroughly for the future. That doesn't only apply to disabled people, of course. There are many circumstances which force you to plan very carefully for the future. But in my case, having my diagnosis redefined, having it replaced with a different diagnosis, felt in a way like, oddly like a disappointment, that everything I'd done in order to plan for the future I'd have been expecting, even if it wasn't the one I'd hoped for, seemed like a waste of effort in a sense. Perhaps I could have taken things easier, perhaps I could have relaxed more, had more fun, those kinds of thoughts. And at the same time, I mean, those are also very common thoughts to people moving into middle age, I think, just to realize that you're no longer young. So I've tried to navigate between those feelings that can seem specific to me in certain circumstances, but that I strongly suspect are much more universal than that. And I think that's one of the biggest writer's challenges, to try to understand what is your own experience and what is something that can be echoed in other people. And of course, you never know before the book is out in the world.
Right. And this gets connected to what you've said over and over again, and that's also in the beginning pages of the book, is about that this book is about all the work that goes into living your life. It is the unseen, I really don't know what to call it. I just want to call it the unseen part of your life.
Yes.
I'd really like you to comment on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting place of departure. I think that's one of the threads that I felt was the most interesting to pursue after the book was complete, and that kind of led into to my next book, which was published in Norway last fall, which deals much more explicitly with invisible work. And that concept is not mine. I borrow it from a feminist scholarly tradition, a sociological tradition, because it was first used to talk about women's work, really. Work in the home, work having to do with the family, but also emotional work, the work of caring for the emotions of others, largely the emotions of men, making sure that everyone is happy in a particular setting, carrying the responsibility for that. And I felt quite a degree of kinship with that concept, because being disabled or having a chronic illness means taking on quite a lot of invisible work. So I've written about this in other contexts, just the amount of extra effort, for example, that it takes me to drop off or pick up my son at kindergarten, with the sort of the very basic problem of how to open the gate outside his kindergarten, because it's a tall gate. Oh, my words are failing me. The latch that you use to open it is at the very top, much too high for a wheelchair user to reach. So I can reach it because I have a wonderful wheelchair with a seat that elevates, and so I can get it up into a standing position. It's icy in Norway, so I have to be very careful when I reach for it. It's doable, but it takes me a lot more effort than it takes the average person. It's work that has to be done, but it's really not the kind of work that I get paid for doing. And so it's interesting to talk about that kind of extra effort, because I think that's something that isn't often discussed in conversations about disability. Those conversations are often framed in terms of passivity, of retreat from the world, but that's entirely untrue. It's the truth is that it takes a lot more work to be in the world, to do things, because the world is not thought out or planned out for people with various disabilities.
Correct. And this also connects the whole conversation to my next question, because as you are researching still actively, and you've also mentioned this in the second half of your book, where you're looking at the societal, and we've already spoken about the medical gaze, but I'm looking at that you're constantly being gazed upon with a particular perspective because of
Yes.
your condition. And you also said something like you were never alone. And that's a very weighted statement in so many ways. And there's another gaze that you've turned upon yourself, the inward gaze, where you're looking at your own self. You're looking at your vulnerability, your emotional status. You're looking at the physical aspects of it. And in this connection, I'd really like you to talk about how you're dealing with that gaze, because it does form a part of your daily life and also a part of your professional life.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I realize in writing about this that I'm speaking about a background of privilege as well, and growing up in a Scandinavian welfare state where there were people present who could help me with various things. I'm talking about my time in school now, where assistants were present, who were, of course, very important in some contexts. And at the same time, they had a disciplinary role in a way, always being followed around by something like an assistant teacher is not always a good way to be for a child. And that, or some version of that, is very closely connected to what you were talking about regarding staring. Rosemarie Garland Thompson, who is a disability scholar, talks about disabled people's experiences of being professional starees, being very familiar with the stares of others, and in some sense always being on stage, performing a role in a way. That process is difficult because it forces you in some way to negotiate with people's expectations about you, their prejudice, their stereotypes. It's very, very hard to blend into the crowd when, for example, you're a wheelchair user. But the more subtle thing is that it's very hard to well, to use a sort of a terribly overused phrase, it's very hard to be yourself, because you're always in some sense dealing with the you that is constructed by others. So yeah, I mean, I've tried to exercise the inward gaze, but I've found that it's almost impossible to do away with societal stereotypes, with expectations. I think the best I can do, and possibly the best anyone can do, is to try to use them and subvert them in some way. I mean, there are a number of stereotypes about disabled people. There is, of course, the sort of the object of pity, the beggar. There is also the villain in some cases. I mean, there are so many disabled villains on film and in television, more than you can shake a stick at. But beyond that, there is also the inspirational story, the heroic story. In each of those cases, the disabled person becomes someone onto whom others can project their ideologies, their expectations, their fears, partly. It's some place to put your own mortality, your own fear of death, to say that, well, at least I'm not as vulnerable as that person. But in each case, it's really a matter of objectifying others. And so I'm not sure how it's possible to do away with that, but it certainly seems helpful to talk about it and to show that process, to show what's going on there.
I'm going to get you back to your writing life. There are beautiful passages in the book where you simply describe how you and your wife spent days writing together and how you followed a routine, sitting in a particular area and just writing. How best can you describe those emotions, those feelings?
Yeah. I mean, that's, I think you're talking partly about some of the time we spent in California at the University of California at Berkeley, which is one of my favorite places in the world, really. And well, I mean, the book is partly about embodied experience. It's also partly about writing and thinking. And for me, that was always, or at least from a quite early age, a place of liberty, a place of flow, because it's one place where I don't have to think about my physical limitations. One of the advantages I had in schooling, again, was to learn to touch type quite early on. And so writing has always been sort of been physically quite easy for me. It's something that's easy for me to do fast. And it's easy for me to reach that stage of flow, quite simply, as the sociologists describe it, where you lose partly track of time and space, and you stay within your activity. You just stay within what the body is doing, what the mind is doing, and it's quite a wonderful place to be. It's also where, of course, a lot of that book came into being, and I wanted to try to reflect that in the text itself. Of course, also as a contrast to the friction that I often experience in encounters with the physical world.
Right, and talking about Berkeley, or it was some other place that you were going to, and you spoke about how your wheelchair couldn't fit into the taxi. And it also brings back those pages in my mind where you spoke about the kind of email exchanges you had with a particular institution about finding a place to stay which was accessible for someone like you. It just struck me that the sense of humor is simply amazing. You've actually made your reader chuckle through your book in spite of the gravity, the complexities. And you've just narrated. So the storytelling is something that I think is inherent in your being. Because you're talking about writing coming in a flow and all of that. And I'm going to, with that comment, take you to your writing for children, though we haven't been able to read because there is no translation, not that I'm aware of. But you've been writing for children, you've done short stories. Could you please tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll reach back to the bureaucratic emails you were referring to. I mean, I do think it's funny. I mean, Kafka has long been one of my favorite writers. And of course, he's incredibly funny about bureaucracy. It's horrible, but it's also very, very funny. And probably that is something that I've explored the most in my short stories. And also to some extent in my writing for children. There is something hilarious, I think, about the way that the rigidities of bureaucratic thinking play out in language. It also sort of sets me off, at least, thinking about how the world could be different, because the world we are living in is patently absurd in so many ways. So why not explore different ways that the world could play out? And those kinds of tangents really set me off at one point, thinking about what if you had living wheelchairs? What if wheelchairs were actually some form of living, breathing animals? That's the children's book that I'm probably the most proud of, trying to write about what is often deemed a sad subject, but in a funny way. So I try to explore different ways that people with mobility impairments could move about. Could they have used chairs with balloons attached to the top? Could they have been riding around on the backs of big monkeys? You never know. And then finally, in this story, the hero discovers a living wheelchair-like creature living on the plains of Persia. And he captures and tames one of these creatures, and they become the prototype for all future wheelchairs. It's been kind of a big hit with at least some children in my life, because I think they need to play with things that they are unfamiliar with, and especially things that adults are sometimes nervous around. My experience with showing my wheelchair to children, again in my son's kindergarten, has been very interesting and fun, because of course to them it's a big toy car. They want to see the lights go on and off. They want to see what the horn sounds like. It's just fascinating to them that a car can be inside a house. And so we have lots to talk about in that vein. And once we've started that conversation, the adults become noticeably less nervous, and it may lead to other positive things.
Right. So it's just, are these being translated in different languages or not?
I think some of my short stories have been translated into Hungarian for odd reasons, and the children's book only into Danish so far, I'm afraid. So I really hope that the living wheelchairs could make it out in the wide world, but we'll see.
Oh, yes, because I'm just being greedy right now. I want to read more of your writing, and I think hopefully after this session, a lot more people will also voice the same opinion. What is it that you're working on right now?
In terms of writing, I'm actually currently putting the final touches to a novel, which is a continuation in many ways of the themes from I Live a Life Like Yours. But there were things that I decided I couldn't really tell within the framework of my own life. Of course, I've known other disabled people growing up and from various walks of life. And there were some issues that I felt I had to deal with in fiction. And these are things that have more to do with what we were talking about earlier with genetic testing and visions of perfection. But also some of the ethical dilemmas that a lot of people with genetic conditions face at various points in their life. So I try to tell a story about what it means to value or devalue a life, something that often happens on the basis of an illness, a condition, but which I think have much more to do with the kind of society that we live in. So it's, well, the working title for the novel is Trying and Failing. So we'll see what happens with that.
That is, I think that really needs to reach the world. And with that, I come to the end of my questions for you. But is there anything you'd like to say before we leave about the kind of literary compatibility you drew from Mark O'Brien, or there are other literary personalities that you mention in your book because they were some way or the other connected with your writing life and also with your very existence?
Yes. Well, a book that was really sort of the a skeleton key for this book in many ways was Maggie Nelson's wonderful book called The Argonauts. I'm not sure how to place it in genre. It's poetry, it's theory, it's many other things. It's very close to the body. It deals with themes that are in one way very distant from my own book, but I read it in 2016, I think it was, and suddenly thought, you're allowed to do that. You can mix all of these things together. You can make associative connections whenever you want to. You can bring yourself close to the reader, and at the same time deal with all of these issues from academia. You can mix it all up. That was a wonderful experience for me. So I mean, that's one of the reasons why there are so many direct quotes in my own book. I thought I'll steal that from Maggie Nelson. And then afterwards discovered that she'd stolen it from Roland Barthes. So it's the great literary tradition of stealing and using everything you can find.
I won't call it stealing, but yes, it just made us join so many more dots and made us think more. I think for the reader, it was just a way of engaging at different levels, which is what your book manages to achieve. Your writing basically manages to reach out to the deeper recesses of our minds and hearts. So I'm really thankful for that. And I will look forward to reading more of your books in translation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation.
So did I. Thank you. It's been a huge learning to just know you through your writing and to have met you right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jaipur Literature Festival. We would like to thank Jan Grue and Mita Kapur for that absolutely inspiring discussion and a great note to end the second day of programming. We also thank the Royal Norwegian Embassy in India and especially His Excellency Hans Jakob Friedenlund for his support and their support throughout the festival. We hope you enjoyed it. We also hope to see you at the Jaipur Music Stage, which is due in half an hour. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening as well at the festival. Thank you and have a lovely evening ahead.